Okay, let's talk about analytics. A question that I think a lot of people have is, do analytics matter? Should we pay attention to this stuff when it comes to something like sports? Well, to get into do analytics matter or not, it's actually, well, it seems kind of obvious or simple. It's actually quite complex and kind of gets into why we as humans make decisions in general, how we come to any conclusions. So that seems like a bit of an ambitious task for a YouTube video on a sports channel, but that's what we're going to discuss today. So let's just get into it. Why do analytics matter, and why do we come to the conclusions that we come to in life, I guess, are the two things we're going to hopefully answer in this video. So I'm going to have a couple of MS Paint charts. I think I'll put myself on the screen as well so you can not just have to look at the chart. But first, let's start off with, if you're evaluating, let's just use a football player. If you're evaluating a football player, first, you start off with nothing, right? You start off with no knowledge of the football player. Here is Joe Smith. How is he at football? I don't know. Well, okay, how do I figure out if I want to know if he's going to be good or bad at the NFL level? Let's say he's a college prospect. I want to figure out if he's going to be good when he goes to the NFL. Well, first, what do I have to do? I have to gather information. So that's what I do. I want to gather information. And here's the first part where analytics come into play, right? Because what information do you gather? Well, for me, I want to know everything. I want to know every detail. I want to know, different traits. I want to know different numbers, everything. So something like this is probably what it would look like for me. Okay, I want to know his numbers, his speed, what college did he go to, how old is he, what's his talent level in specific traits, what's his football IQ, all of that stuff. I want to know every little tidbit of information I can find. Give me that. And then I will use that information to ultimately come to a conclusion. And I think this is something that most of us get behind. We all kind of agree. Yeah, this is how we come to conclusions is we, start off with nothing. We gather as much information as possible and then come to a conclusion. And I think most people also would get behind, okay, well, this is where analytics can come into play. Give me, that's one trait that you can have that you would essentially be severing if you do not come to a conclusion. It's actually a little more complex than that. First, I should give the counter argument for why analytics maybe in this situation wouldn't matter, right? If you are someone who says, I don't think analytics matter, who cares about this stuff? Because if you're watching the film, you'll know if a player has a high pass rush win rate. You don't necessarily need to look at numbers to see that. If you're watching the tape, why do you need a number to just back up what you saw on tape? Well, because sometimes things get lost when you watch film. I'll say this from experience. I am someone who watches film for a living. It does sometimes happen where your subconscious bias maybe overrates splash plays and underrates the little things that a player does. Like, let's say there are two different players, player A and player B, and we're just going to talk about 5 specific snaps from these two players. The first player has 4 we'll say they're edge rushers. The first player has 4 losses and then has an awesome win for a pressure. Not a sack, but it just looks awesome. Really cool play. Whereas player B doesn't quite do that, but they have 3 pressures on 5 plays. Some people, when you're watching, might actually overrate player A and underrate player B, even though player B had a lot more value on those 5 plays because of how cool that last play looked. And while I'm using 5 plays just kind of to make the argument, remember, when you're watching film of a player, you might be watching 1,000 plays of a player, and the difference between a good pass rush win rate and a bad pass rush win rate, like a 5% jump, is huge. You can't be expected to remember that clearly. And while you could come up with your own rating system, I think using someone else's rating system is still a valid way to help yourself make an argument. So that would be my argument as to why analytics are something you should just simply look at. And I think most people can get behind that. But I would also say I think analytics are actually a necessity in terms of how you're going to evaluate a player. Why do I feel that way? Well, let's kind of talk about just certain traits in general. Let's say you have a player, we'll say Joe Smith again. He's an edge rusher, and these are his pros and his cons. You've done your evaluation, you've gathered your data. This is how you feel about Joe Smith. He's a very fast player. His speed rush is very good. He forced a lot of fumbles. He seems to have great leadership from what people say about him. He comes from a winning program, won a national championship in his time in college, and had a high sack total. His cons, though, not the strongest player. He has a low pass rush win rate, and he's old for a prospect. He's going to be 25 in his rookie year. What do we do with that player? They have some strengths. They have some cons. how do we evaluate him and how do we ultimately decide if this player should be drafted first overall or in the second round? How do we make that decision? Well, let's go back to this chart again and let's go trait by trait because that's what we have to do. We have to figure out how much these specific traits matter. So let's just use fast as our example. Does being fast as an edge rusher matter? And really what I mean is not 40 time, but how quick are you off the line, right? How good is your speed rush? Something that on paper would matter some, right? So, okay, does being fast matter? Well, one thing we have to once again do is gather info. Although I say that, but what info do you really gather here, right? You already have the information of if the player is fast. You have to gather the information of does being fast matter and how do you do that? Well, one way you can do that is just, I think, probably the most common way. So common, it's called common sense, right? Common sense is a way that we a lot of times just come to our conclusions that way. For example, should I put my hand on the stove? Well, no, putting my hand on the stove is hot, hurts my hand. I don't want to do that, right? You could argue that sometimes you do that with gathering information of if you've touched a stove before, you know it's hot and won't do it again. But you don't need to have touched a hot stove to know you shouldn't touch a hot stove. And you don't need to have seen or heard that touching a hot stove would hurt your hand to know not to touch a hot stove. However, this is the very surface level way of thinking, right? It can work in certain obvious situations, but the reality is you probably want to use more than just simple common sense, right? You probably want to have some more information. So again, does being fast matter? Common sense says, well, sure, being fast means you can get past the tackle, you can get to the quarterback, but how much does being fast matter is the question that we're trying to really answer here. So we need to dig a little bit deeper here. This is the real question we need to answer. How often do fast prospects work out, right? That's the information we need to gather if we can figure out does being fast matter and how much does being fast matter and how do we go about figuring out how often fast prospects work out. Most of us do not do a scientific study on this. And what most of us do is we think back to previous fast prospects, which is heavily misleading because usually when you think back to previous fast prospects, you're thinking about guys that did work out because you remember those. The guy who was picked 28th and never made it in the NFL, you don't really think about that much. Who do you think about more, TJ Watt or Joe Tryon-Shoyinka? I think I know the answer. So to me, this is why I say analytics are an absolute necessity. It's this aspect of the evaluation prospect, figuring out how often specific traits matter. I want to run studies on every one of these types of traits. Does speed matter? Well, let's run studies on it. And for just about every position, that's what I've done on this channel. Figured this stuff out. For what it's worth, no, it's actually not that important when it comes to pass rushers. It's something to look into, and it is a trait that can help you, but there's other traits that are that correlate much more to the NFL, which can logically make sense, right? If we're at my conclusion now, I can kind of use my logical reasoning to fill in the blanks. If being fast doesn't matter that much, my guess would be it's because, well, tackles at the NFL are a lot faster than they are in college, so you need to be able to have strength along with being fast. Again, matters, but maybe isn't as important as some other traits. So ultimately, this is how I view this process. I try and look at certain players, look at all of their traits, and then, especially the most important ones, and then simply just say, okay, how much do these traits translate to be going to the next level? It's also what everyone else does. That's how we evaluate this stuff. It's just analytics can kind of give us a clearer picture on why these traits matter and why they don't, while ignoring it leaves your mind, leaves yourself open to your mind playing tricks on you. I also want to be clear here at the end of this and say that doesn't necessarily mean numbers are always the best way to evaluate a prospect. Like, let's use a couple to note. A couple years back, I made a video on PFF grades and how well do those translate to, how well do players of good PFF grades translate to being good players, and how often do players of bad PFF grades translate to being bad players. And I went position by position. Edge rusher, for example, really good correlation. If you have a very good PFF grade, you're probably going to be a very good NFL player. If you have a very bad PFF grade, you're probably going to be a very bad NFL player. But positions like quarterback and wide receiver actually had next to no correlation there. So this can also help us, right? It can tell us in this situation that actually paying attention more to the tape and less to numbers is a way to evaluate these players better. To me, that is still analytics. That is still using the scientific method when it comes to sports, which is what Billy Beane, when he invented Moneyball, was trying to do, right? So ultimately, I do think that you are leaving something on the table if you do not just focus on that. How often do traits help you? Things like that. Again, applying the scientific method to football is something that has been proven to work and continues to work for the teams that are willing to look into this kind of stuff. There's a reason why just about every single team has an analytics department. It's because they help. But again, in conclusion as well, just want to mention, it also drives me crazy when you'll see some of those like stats nerds who will say, oh, but look at this quarterback's PFF grade. Clearly you are a fool for not evaluating them highly. It's like, well, no, because you also are doing the same thing you're accusing the person who only looks at traits of doing, is you have only one thing you're looking at, but haven't looked into, is there actual correlation for that mattering, which is what also bothers me. So sometimes the people that don't like analytics are right about things as well. So we got to pay attention to that. So yeah. In conclusion, those are my thoughts on all of this. Hopefully you enjoyed this kind of video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.